Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of different types of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. So for today's video we're going to be discussing the case of the Crawford family murders, but before we get started discussing the video I just want to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. If you aren't new to my channel then you'll know that Skillshare have been supporting my channel and its content for a little while now, and it is something that I personally genuinely love to use myself. If you've never heard of Skillshare before, it's an online learning community where there are thousands of video classes on virtually any topic you could want. I personally feel as though they are the perfect sponsor for my channel, as we all share a love of education here, and Skillshare is a place sort of where all these creatives can come together and build on their interests and passions through these video classes. As always, I like to give you guys a recommendation of a class that I've been loving recently, and recently my favourite has been one called Video for Instagram, Tell an Engaging Story in Less Than a Minute by Halise Narvaez. I apologise if I mispronounced that. As my channel is now very heavily focused on the educational content, and I've since moved away from putting up lifestyle content here, I've been focusing a lot more of that lifestyle content over on my Instagram, and I found that this video class has really helped me to sort of open my eyes to different techniques that can be used when creating short video content. As I'm sure you're aware, if you're on my channel, my typical day-to-day creations are these longer videos, and the class also goes into the basics of storytelling itself, so I've been able to ensure that I understand exactly how to keep the content entertaining for you guys and make it personal to my style and tastes. And obviously, as Skillshare are the sponsor of today's video, they are bringing my viewers a very special offer. So the first 1,000 of you that click the link in my description box will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, so you guys can explore these classes yourselves. And as I always say, after giving you guys my recommendations, please do let me know what classes you've been loving down below if you have taken up this fantastic offer. And a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. So before we get started discussing the case, I'm just going to whiz through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the Crawford family's murders. The Crawford family's case begins in the year of 1970 in Victoria, Australia. At the time of this case taking place, the family consisted of Elmer Kyle Crawford, his wife Therese, and their children 13-year-old Catherine, 8-year-old James, and 6-year-old Karen. At that time, Elmer Crawford worked as a telephone technician in the Victoria Racing Club at Flemington Racecourse, and he had done so for the previous 14 years. He was known to be a friendly enough man to work with, although he was known to not really share a lot with his colleagues in terms of details about his personal life. He would simply turn up for work, get the job done and leave. The family all lived together at number 136 Cardinal Road in Glenroy, Victoria, and none of their neighbours had been aware of anything going wrong inside of the family home, nor had they had any reason to suspect that this ordeal would soon occur. On July the 2nd, 1970, a family had taken a trip to Lochard George in Port Campbell, nearly a 3-hour drive from where the Crawford family lived in Glenroy. This family pulled up to the edge of a large cliff overlooking the water on like a sightseeing trip, a cliff which you could pretty much walk up straight to the edge to. They had a few sort of large rocks in place to stop any cars from getting too close to the edge, but if you wanted to, you could literally stand on the edge of the cliff and look down at the water. So this family had pulled up somewhat close to the edge, but obviously they'd stayed sort of a short distance back to ensure their safety. As they did so, they noticed a set of tyre tracks going up to the cliff edge and seemingly driving over the edge. They had obviously immediately become concerned at this finding, and so they inched closer to the edge in an attempt to see whether a vehicle had in fact gone over the edge and whether someone needed help. As they peered over the edge of the cliff, they spotted a Holden FE sedan perched on the edge of a ledge near the bottom of the cliff, balancing precariously overlooking the water. This family hadn't been able to see anyone inside the vehicle or sort of stood on the ledge around the car, nor could they hear anyone calling for help, but they'd been able to make out a license plate number from the distance. And so they headed to the nearest police station to report their finding. Now, sadly, news of this discovery had not been entirely a surprise to the local authorities, as this cliff was known to be a popular spot for people to go and take their own lives. But because this car in particular had not yet been reported and the tyre tracks at the top of the cliff appeared to be recent, the authorities headed down to the scene in case anyone was there that needed help. 2 cliff rescue volunteers were lowered down to the car before the authorities were planning on lifting the car up to the top of the cliff edge in order for them to sort of stabilise the car, make sure that it wasn't going to fall in the water, and just to establish what they were dealing with. Inside the car, they found a large piece of tarpaulin in the back of the vehicle, and when they lifted up one of the corners, they noticed 4 sets of feet, followed by a strong rancid smell, and they soon realised that they'd discovered 4 sets of human remains. The victims found in the car were all dressed in their pyjamas and wrapped in a blanket each, but strangely enough, the back seat of the car had been completely removed. They also found a rifle inside the vehicle as well as a hose connecting the exhaust of the car and then having been trapped in the window of the driver's side. The fact that the car had seemingly been driven off of the cliff and the hose having been connected from the exhaust to the inside of the car, it seemed that whoever had been driving the car had carried out a murder-suicide. But this case wasn't at all as simple as what it first seemed. When the authorities looked into the car's number plate and registration details that were left inside, they soon traced the car back to the Crawford family. And it was soon made clear that the family inside the car was missing a member, and it had been Elmer Crawford. Inside the car were the remains of Therese, Catherine, James and Karen, but no sign of the patriarch. The authorities who had been dealing with the car had made a nearly 3-hour trip up to the Crawford's home in Glenroy to see if they could find any answers at the house. It was initially theorised that possibly Elmer had been inside the car when it had driven off of the cliff, but he'd been thrown out of the window upon impact on the ledge and subsequently thrown in the water. When they had no answer at the Crawford family home, this theory was somewhat supported, especially when they discovered a loaf of bread outside the front door that had been delivered but hadn't been taken in the house, and so it seemed as though there was no one in the home and there hadn't been for a little while. The authorities had set to work recreating the scene at the cliff, believing this to be their crime scene. They brought in a car that matched the family's sedan to ensure that the results were as accurate as possible, but they found that the dummy that they'd placed in the driver's seat, theoretically representing Elmer, the dummy actually stayed inside the vehicle upon impact. And so the question remained, where is Elmer Crawford? Something else that they revisited during these tests was the evidence that there was a piece of rope inside the Crawford's car attaching the wheel to the boot of the car, something that they believed may have been used to ensure that the car had driven straight while there hadn't actually been anyone driving. When the internal workings of the Crawford's car were examined, they found evidence to suggest that the car hadn't been spinning while it crashed, meaning that there had been no one inside the car accelerating. And the most obvious explanation for this would be that the car was kept in neutral and pushed off of the edge of the cliff. There had also been patches of blood found inside the car, mostly on the roof, and when this was later tested, it was found to be type O blood, something that I'll come back to later on in the video. So back to the Crawford family home. Investigators had received a few phone calls from the neighbours of the Crawfords, who they had previously spoken to and been told that no one knew why the family would have left their home or even that they'd left at all. But these following phone calls from neighbours had informed the authorities that they believed that Elmer's motorbike was still parked outside the back of the family home, something which the neighbours stressed he would never go anywhere without. And so this prompted their return to the family's home in search of their prime suspect and some more answers. Once entering the home at 136 Cardinal Road, they soon realised that their crime scene had not in fact been the cliff edge at all, but rather the family's home. Inside the property, they found a lot of blood, all appearing to be half cleaned, and a number of electrical wires with large alligator clips attached to the ends of them, and this seemed just to raise a lot of questions initially for the investigators. There was no sign of any bodies inside the home, but there had also been no sign of Elmer Crawford. In an attempt to avoid any cross-contamination contamination at this crime scene, law enforcement officers were given a specific room in the home to investigate, and they found 2 large blood trails leading from 2 rooms in the house, specifically to the kitchen. And in the kitchen, there had also been a large blood stain on the floor, as well as a wet pair of men's pyjamas. Inside the kitchen sink, they found a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy, and the milk was still fresh enough to indicate that someone had recently left it there. The investigators had specifically looked for any signs of forced entry into the property in order to establish whether an unknown individual had broken into the home and attacked the family, but when they found no sign of such, they soon realised that there was something a lot more sinister going on here. And on the kitchen table, there were a select few handwritten notes that they'd found. One of these notes had been addressed to someone named Jean Crawford, and this note had simply said "next of kin" and appeared to be half finished. The next note was addressed to their milkman, and it stated that they would no longer be needing any deliveries from him to their home. And these notes hadn't appeared to be finished or sent off, and so it looked as though someone had been interrupted partway through writing them. And then in the living room, they found another note that appeared to have been written by Therese Crawford, and it was addressed to her sister. In this note, she had gone on to explain that she was actually pregnant with another child, but she was unhappy with the news and felt that she couldn't do anything about it. In the same area, they also found an engagement ring and a cut-out newspaper article that featured a woman talking about her experience of depression following an abortion. And after discovering this in the home, the authorities soon realised that there had actually been another victim found in the car, and it had been Therese and Elmer's 4th child who had yet to be born. When the blood samples inside the home were tested, they discovered that the blood had been type A blood, whilst, as I previously mentioned, the blood inside the car was found to be type O. And out of the members of the Crawford family, Elmer had been the only one with type O blood, whilst the other family members all had type A. Following the tests carried out involving the car and the information that they'd gathered at the home, investigators had started to realise that Elmer Crawford was likely involved in the deaths of his family, and he was still on the run. They received tips from the neighbours who claimed that they believed that they had seen Elmer himself during the day when his family had been found at the bottom of the cliff, something that hadn't initially been strange to them as they weren't yet aware of the deaths, and there was nothing unusual about your neighbour standing on the driveway. As they spoke more to the neighbours of the family, they had painted a rather pleasant picture of Elmer Crawford. They described him as a man who was always helping out other people on the street, fixing children's bikes, and even setting up illegal phone lines for everyone on the street so that they didn't have to pay their phone bills. But there had been a select few people who had told the investigators that Elmer did in fact have a bit of a temper when he wasn't in a good mood, and these individuals had described incidents in which he would suddenly explode in this fit of anger. When they dug even further into the family's activities prior to their deaths, they found that just 2 weeks prior, Therese and Elmer had written a new will which stated that all money was to legally be given to Elmer in the case of a family accident. So investigators thought back to the note found in the home regarding Therese's pregnancy and considered the possibility of whether a discussion of this pregnancy had had some involvement in the murders. Authorities had also stumbled across some information relating to Elmer's employment as they learned that for quite some time before the murders, he had actually been stealing supplies whilst he was at work and then taking them home and selling them on to make money. And they'd also been given the impression that he was very soon going to be caught for it and reprimanded, possibly by losing his job. It seemed to the authorities that if their prime suspect, Elmer, had been the one responsible for the murders, both money and the knowledge of pregnancy may have contributed to the motive of such. They started to piece together a potential timeline of what could have occurred to the family that day inside their home, and they believed that Therese had been the first to be killed, as Elmer knew that she would never go along with this plan of killing their children. It seemed that he had waited for his children to be asleep, which is then when he gathered his electrical creation to be used on his victims. So he'd made a device out of 15 meters of electrical cord with a plug at one end and then an extension lead on the other, and then coming off of this was 5 slightly shorter leads, all with alligator clips attached to the ends. It's believed that he had come up behind Therese while she was writing letters just before going to bed, when she'd obviously heard him approaching her. When she turned to face him, he then proceeded to beat her and attached the alligator clips from his device to her ears and electrocuted her. The eldest daughter, Catherine, had met the same fate as her mother. She was beaten and then electrocuted, but rather than electrocuting the youngest daughter, Karen, he'd only beat her using a hammer as opposed to electrocuting her as well. At some point during the commotion, James, the middle child, had woken up and started heading in the direction of where he believed his mother would be, but before he could do so, he met the same fate as his older sister and his mother. He'd made the extra effort to cover the bodies in tarpaulin and miscellaneous rubbish so that if he was stopped for whatever reason on his journey, he would be able to keep them hidden. And it was later found out that Elmer had actually been a regular visitor of the area in which the bodies had been driven off of the cliff, as he was known to hike and camp in the area frequently, so all of this information really points towards the murders being meticulously pre-planned. And Elmer had gone as far as to pre-fill up the car with petrol so that he wouldn't need to stop on his journey to Lockhart Gorge and risk someone spotting the bodies in his car or creating a paper trail of his journey. When he had arrived at the cliff edge, the weather was particularly rainy and it had gotten dark, so he had to get to work quickly. There were a select few large rocks, as I said, placed along the cliff edge that prevented people from driving over the edge, but rather than stopping Elmer, he simply took a bit of time to move these heavy rocks to clear a path. It's theorised that the type O blood found inside the car had actually been Elmer's and that he'd injured himself whilst attempting to move these large rocks, and he'd climbed back in the car briefly to get out of the rain and take a break. He'd then attached a hose to the exhaust and fed it through the driver's window in an attempt to mask the murders as a suicide. He had tried placing a hammer inside of a large boot and fixing it down onto the accelerator and proceeded to then push the car over the cliff. It seemed to many that this murder would have been so perfectly planned out if it had not been for the ledge at the bottom of the cliff that investigators believed had been a complete shock to Elmer. Rather than look over the edge of the cliff to make sure that the car had reached the water as he'd planned, he ran straight away from the scene of the crime out of fear that the rain would cause him to slip off of the edge if he got too close. There's a bit of speculation as to how he got from this cliff back to his home in Glenroy that night, but some people believe he hitchhiked, some people believe he bought an electric scooter with him, so it's not entirely known, but all it's known is that he returned back to his home in Glenroy. And this was believed to have all occurred sometime between sunset on the 1st of July and in the early hours of the following morning, and the family discovering the car at the bottom of the cliff had been approximately 1:30 p.m. on that 2nd of July. Investigators had also believed that it was likely that Elmer had then returned to his home with the plan of cleaning up the crime scene inside the property and had subsequently planned on then reporting the family as missing so that he could shift some of the suspicion. But when he had learned that the car had been discovered a lot quicker than he had expected, since it hadn't hit the water and been hidden like he'd planned, his plans suddenly changed and he had to abandon his hopes of concealing all of the evidence inside the home. Since that day, Elmer Crawford remains a missing person and a prime suspect in the murder of Therese, Catherine, James, Karen and their unborn child. The last known sighting of him had been the neighbour's claims of seeing him stood on his driveway on the day that the family discovered the car at the bottom of the cliff. There had been an alleged sighting of him in 1994 somewhere in the western region of Australia by an individual who claimed he had previously been an acquaintance of Elmer, but this could never be confirmed by the authorities. In 2008, authorities had posted a $1,000 reward in exchange for information leading to the arrest of Elmer Crawford, but nothing came as a result. In 2010, there appeared to be a break in the case when the Victoria Police had announced that they'd come across a John Doe case from Texas from 2005. This individual had no fingerprints and he had numerous IDs on him that were displaying different names, and they announced that they were attempting to use DNA and facial recognition technology to establish whether this John Doe had been Elmer Crawford. But in the following month, they publicly announced that as a result of the blood samples taken from inside the car in the initial crime scene, they can confirm that they weren't a match. In 2017, it was announced that a man who had previously worked as a truck driver had believed he had encountered Elmer a few years prior. This man claimed he had encountered a man matching Elmer's description, and he told the witness that he had a wife before then saying, "I had to leave in a hurry, I did something terrible." And this witness had placed this sighting at being somewhere in the Australian outback, and despite this not ever being confirmed, it is considered a possibility that maybe Elmer had eluded the authorities by escaping and living in the outback. It's not exactly known why Elmer Crawford would have murdered his wife and children. It may have been the result of an argument over whether or not to keep their unborn child, as the evidence found in the living room would suggest. It may have been because Therese had discovered that her husband had been stealing equipment from his workplace and had threatened to expose him, or possibly as a means of him collecting the money from their recently altered will, or his motive may have been all of the above. But until there are any more updates in this case, Elmer Crawford remains a missing person. And that is where I'm going to end today's video. So as always, please do leave your thoughts down below, whether there are any theories that stick out to you. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on this case. A big final thank you to Skillshare for being the sponsor of today's video. And as I said, there will be a link in the description for you guys to click if you want to make the most of the offer. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.